Thank you, Peter.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And thank you, Seth, for that presentation. I couldn't help but laugh a little bit when I was thinking about the different types of anarchy that would, perhaps make for a good academic paper: paleo anarchy, crypto anarchy, proto anarchy, but all very interesting. This is the U.S.-China Commission's annual report to Congress. Came out last month. Some of you may have seen it. If you don't have a hard copy, you can certainly access it online at uscc.gov. I'm here speaking in my own personal, representing myself. I'm going to try to relate to you some of the findings of the Commission from this year's report. But once again, this is a consensus report, but we don't agree on every issue. There are 12 commissioners on a bipartisan panel, and so even though I feel like I'm trying to relay the findings of the Commission, I think there are some differences of opinion, obviously. The report is, which shouldn't surprise you, spent a lot of time on the military side of issues. Looking at it, we look at economic issues, we look at security issues, and a good deal of the report looks at that. And I think it's fair to say, and this dovetails with what Seth was just talking about, is that China's military modernization, build-up, whatever you call it, has benefited from more than 2 decades of nearly double growth increases in their announced defense budget, and that means more than 10%. And of course, there's a small cottage industry out there, I'm sure, within the government and outside the government, that looks at the Chinese defense budget and trying to figure out what's included, what's not included, differences in currencies, because the Chinese currency isn't convertible. Probably, I would guess it's cheaper to produce things in China than it might be in the United States. So you have to be careful. You can look at the defense budget. It gives you an idea. It gives you a snapshot. It gives you some trends. But it's not, in my view, fully representative of Chinese military capabilities or the entire picture. But we do know that the Chinese have told us, showing some level of transparency, that it increased just this year over 12% over last year's. So we're talking about China coming from a very low level of military capability 20 years ago, but they've been using double-digit increases in their defense budget to improve that capability. The official number is about $130 billion, but I think, once again, I think that's understated by any numbers of magnitude. Like I said, once again, it doesn't give us a full picture of Chinese military capabilities. But anyway, here's some of the other things that we found. China conducted its first test of a new hypersonic missile vehicle, which has the potential to conduct kinetic strikes on a very rapid basis anywhere in the world. This is a step above and beyond an intercontinental ballistic missile. It also performed its second test of a new road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile, known as the DF-31, at least outside the government. I'm not sure what the government inside the government they're calling it, whether it's what version, A, B, C, etc. But it will have the capability to strike the entirety of the United States. As you know, China has an aircraft carrier. It's spent some time at sea, continued to increase its capabilities and its operational readiness this year with a long-distance training deployment in 2014. On a similar note, as Seth noted, the United States Navy is also facing an anti-ship ballistic missile. This is, which is quite interesting. The idea of a ballistic missile capable of hitting a moving target at sea is of interest, and many people have noted this as a carrier killer, and obviously of tremendous concern to the U.S. Navy and American and regional security analysts. Seth also noted that they're expanding and improving their Navy. He talked about the number of new ships, but they have new ships that are increasingly capable in terms of weapon systems and sensors. On submarines, which would be of interest to some in the audience, they have a growing fleet. And when we talk about modern submarines, and we have that definition within the book, but in 2000 they had about 1 modern submarine. Today they have nearly 40. So that's significant, especially considering the challenges we have in our own shipbuilding programs. It's also expanded its patrols. China for a long time had been a brown water navy, and now it's certainly becoming a blue water navy, as we know. There's There's an old interesting story, it may be apocryphal, about Mao, and it took Mao 3 years after he took over in 1949 to visit the Chinese Navy. It was of so little importance at that time. Today, the Chinese Navy, because of the ability to project power, because of Chinese interests around its periphery, especially at sea, Chinese commercial interests, is becoming increasingly important to the Chinese leadership. Obviously, doing a lot of patrolling in the East and South China Seas, which includes territorial disputes with the Japanese, Philippines, and others, but also made its first ever, what they call a combat readiness patrol, not sure exactly what that means, in the Indian Ocean this year. China also continues to increase its nuclear forces and enhance its strategic nuclear capabilities. While progress is made in the next 3 to 5 years, China's nuclear force will expand, become more lethal, and become more survivable. Another issue of concern, especially to the U.S. Navy, or actually to the National Command Authorities, is China's nuclear platform. They have their first, they have had one for many years, but they have a new, modern fleet ballistic missile submarine, an SSBN, and that will be equipped with a JL-2 intercontinental ballistic missile, sea-launched ballistic missile that can reach the entirety of the United States. And I'm not sure if it has as of yet, but it's expected that in short order it's going to be able to start conducting combat patrols at sea with that JL-2, which means China will have another leg in its nuclear capabilities. They've always had an air capability for gravity bombs. Some people are wondering if they will move towards nuclear-capable air-launched cruise missiles. And they obviously have a land base, so they at least have a nuclear dyad at this point when these JL-2s go to sea on these Jin-class submarines. China's also spending a lot of time on space and counterspace, not surprisingly. It continues to expand and improve. China conducted its third land-based missile intercept test this year, which was believed to be an anti-satellite test, although I believe the Chinese denied that. We assess that China is likely to be able to hold U.S. national security satellites in every orbital regime at risk within the next 5 to 10 years. I think that's really significant for an operational standpoint for the U.S. military. All of these developments I talked about are basically allowing China to give an increasing ability to challenge the decades of U.S. air and naval dominance in the Western Pacific. And depending on how you want to phrase it, there is a shift, probably because of China's rising capabilities in the military balance in the Asia-Pacific theater, because China's coming from at such an increasing level of capability so quickly, and the challenges in the United States that Seth had talked about, especially for the Navy, are of significant, should be of significant concern to all of us. So in light of these developments, which was a quick overview, here's some of the Commission's recommendations. And like I said, we've got more than just these, but these are some of the ones we think are critically important. We ask that Congress appoint an outside panel of experts to do a net assessment. We hear from a lot of different quarters about U.S. versus Chinese military capabilities. The government is probably doing their own net assessments, but I think it's also, in the past, we've seen some utility in having a panel of outside experts, such as the Rumsfeld Commission going back to the late 1990s on North Korean missile capabilities, giving them access to the classified information that was required, and have them do a red team assessment and see where we're really at in terms of that. So a net assessment. So we've asked Congress to do something along those lines. And then to see if the United States has the capabilities, plans, and budgets to meet the security requirements in light of what they find. So I think it's about time we do that. Also, I'm concerned that we don't necessarily have a good grasp of Chinese strategic doctrine and capabilities. There's a lot of things changing, these road mobile ICBMs. There's been some research done in open source, such as at Georgetown, where they found the Great Underground Wall, where China may have thousands of kilometers of underground tunnels that may be subordinate to their second artillery, which is their missile and nuclear capable forces. The number of Chinese, in my mind, like I said, this is not based on classified information, but just from the outside, the number when we hear about new missile capabilities with MIRVing, It's interesting to me that on classified level, we've seen the Chinese number of Chinese warheads generally stay pretty much the same. So I don't know how that can be. And so I think this is critically important. The other thing here is what effect is China's increasing strategic capabilities having on doctrine? You know, there's an old question, does technology drive doctrine or does doctrine drive technology? So if you're basically involved in a counter-value, second strike doctrine for many years because of the limited number of limited amount of nuclear capability you have, if that shifts, might you start moving to a counterforce capability? And I think I hope that somebody's looking at this very closely, but I would like to see the government making sure they have a sense. So if China's capability is better than it was in the past, maybe they're moving away from counter-value to counter-force. I think it's a pretty important question. And so we're asking that the Congress, via the Government Accounting Office or another appropriate organization, look at this matter. Another thing we reiterated as one of our top recommendations from last year was that the United States meet its shipbuilding capabilities or requirements and operational efforts to increase our presence in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think Seth did a good job of talking about those things. Another thing that we found this year is that China is increasingly active on foreign and national security policy issues. And President Xi Jinping seems to be in complete control of the security apparatus. In the past, we've often seen the Chinese president move slowly in the direction of taking over the Central Military Commission, the CMC. He took it over pretty much right away. So he wears all three hats now, with the party as the president of the country and also the chairman of the Military Commission. And I think he's stepping out. China is stepping out of the shadows. It's no longer a bide your time sort of Deng Xiaoping sort of approach to things. And he's made some public pronouncements I think that we should pay attention to. For instance, quoting here, he says that we should rely on the people of Asia to run Asia's affairs, deal with Asia's problems, and uphold Asian security. Now, of course, many people would say that the United States is an Asian nation or a Pacific nation. I'm not quite sure the Chinese see it that way. So it's not clear if we're part of that or we're excluded from that ideal. And I think President Xi has taken a much more assertive role in terms of the issues of the East and South China Sea, which you're all aware of, the territorial disputes with the Japanese in the Senkakus, and also in the South China Sea, with the Philippines and with all the other nations that make the claims there. The establishment of an air defense identification zone in ADIZ in the East China Sea. This was unprecedented. This was unprecedented for China. The deployment, which I believe has been removed now, of an oil rig into what I think everybody would agree were Vietnamese waters. And I think this is one of the most interesting things to me. I don't know if you've seen this. We do have it in our book, and I think we have some pictures of Chinese reclamation projects in the South China Sea where they're actually creating islands. And it seems to be expected that they'll use these for military purposes, such as building airfields, military outposts, probably intelligence collection, ISR sort of operations. So they're actually building islands in the South China Sea. Now, there's a lot of question about what they're really getting at that. I think it's creeping sovereignty. China basically claims that the entirety of the South China Sea, 1 million square miles, has Chinese sovereign territory. They're not abiding by the UN law of the sea, conditions that they signed up to, and I'm not sure exactly how they will. I don't know how the UN is going to deal with the idea of creating islands and whether you're allowed to consider them to be sovereign territory because you're creating them. So it's some interesting things there. And I think we've seen over the last year, I can't recall all of them to you because some of them are starting to blend together now. There's been so many years of it, but I think we've seen risky and dangerous behavior at sea and in the air. This is obviously a problem. We saw what happened in 2001 in April with the Chinese, and there's still certainly possibilities of that, or of our aircraft operating in international waters. And of course, a lot of people are wondering about how the Chinese are going to exercise control over the ADIZ. Some of the things that they say in there makes it look like they actually have the right to control aircraft within that. We haven't seen that as yet, but they stated it up front, which is what gave most people pause about the establishment of this ADIZ. Taiwan hasn't fallen off of China's radar in terms of their military buildup. It's still heavily focused on Taiwan, and they increasingly have capabilities to coerce Taiwan in a political direction that Beijing would like. Along these lines, the Commission expressed concern about making sure that the United States Congress and the administration meet Taiwan's military requirements that is consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act. Let me conclude here quickly, just a couple of thoughts. It's my view that China is closing the military capability gaps with potential adversaries in the Pacific, including the United States. It's becoming a modern military with significant power projection capabilities, including cyber and space. I didn't talk a lot about cyber, but I think you're probably all aware of that. Every year we focus on some issues, not everything in the report, and this year we didn't focus on cyber. We'll probably come back around to that. We have done that in past years, but cyber, we shouldn't forget, and space, I think, are power projection capabilities. We're not just talking about planes and ships. I mean, cyber, as we know, you can reach out at great distance and touch somebody. So it is a power projection capability. You've all seen the reports on Chinese activities in these areas. And of course, space is another thing. I think the United States is, as many modern nations are, increasingly dependent on satellites and computers, and we have to take that into account in our national security planning. I think China is also already feeling increasingly confident about its ability to influence and shape the international environment, and I think it's already taken steps to do so, especially around its periphery and at sea in the East and South China Sea, and which I see as a sort of creeping sovereignty concept. And as a result, I believe that the opportunities for misperceptions, miscalculations, and mistakes that could have serious consequences are increasingly significant in the U.S.-China relationship and China's international relations in general. So I think I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. If I might once again ask the first question here. You mentioned the Chinese doctrine. Where do you think they are heading with that doctrine? Is it to assert sovereignty over what they consider their, I don't know, their near territory, or is it to embark on something more ambitious in terms of even not just domination, but even conquest?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a number of things that motivate a Chinese foreign policy in the East and South China Sea. Obviously, there's a lot of history in that part of the world. Clearly, China remembers its history from the last century, and I think there are still some issues that they feel are unresolved. There's also the issue of energy. China is the world's largest consumer of energy today and the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases. China believes that its economic future is based on its ability to access energy. There may be a lot of energy under the East and South China Sea. In fact, the Chinese are making claims in the Arctic now, even though they're not considered to be an Arctic nation. The USGS has come out and said that they believe that 1/3 of the world's undiscovered but technologically recoverable resources are actually in the Arctic. So the Chinese are thinking about these sort of things. I think it's the Chinese will also say it's historical beyond the history among the states there, that the Chinese were there many years ago, and that it's Chinese because they, it's interesting to see some of how they organize those thoughts and present them to the world, such as finding shards of pottery, Chinese pottery on some of these islands that. Not in the Arctic. No, I'm shifted on you already. Yeah. Well, they haven't said that yet. They haven't said that yet. Obviously, there's a national security concern there. The Chinese, and also a legal concern, use of legal premises. If you claim these islands and its countries acquiesce to Chinese claims of sovereignty, then you can use the UN law of the sea, UNCLOS, to claim the EEZs around those islands. So I think if you look at it, I think with China now, with the islands that it claims, it could, under the UN law of the sea, actually claim about 90% of the South China Sea. I mean, they're claiming it all anyway within this 9-dash line, which has shifted interestingly. The 9-dash line actually comes from the Republic of China on Taiwan. They made that claim first. The Chinese took up that claim, and then there used to be, I think there used to be 11 dashes, and then they resolved something with Vietnam, and it went away during the communist days, the Cold War communist days, and now the most recent one shows a dash line outside of Taiwan. It usually used to go just from south of Taiwan. Now it shows outside. I'm not sure if that, thanks Ryan for bringing those over, that's the Asian Studies Center has that, but I'm not sure it reflects it on there. But there have been some people who follow that very closely have noticed that Chinese official press that produce maps have shown an additional line outside of Taiwan. So there's this issue. Also, the Chinese, if they're able to claim these islands and are able to put military facilities on them, and they're able to perhaps be involved in, as we talk about, access and area denial and anti-access strategies that potentially could close parts of the South China Sea. You have to remember that some of the countries in Northeast Asia, such as Japan, I believe, import 80% of their energy. And a lot of that comes through the South China Sea. We have a tremendous amount. I couldn't tell you the figures right now, but you can look them up quite quickly of the percentage of U.S. trade that goes through that part of the world. So there's, what's I think is important that I always use as a quick shorthand is the issue of threat. I usually say threat is capabilities plus intent. Capabilities takes years to develop often. Intent can change overnight. So if China has the capabilities to do certain things, they could decide, their political leadership could decide at any time that they want to close the South China Sea or do this or that. So there's, I think, in China's, I don't, other than Taiwan and some of these islands that are almost unoccupied, I think I wouldn't say that China is involved at this point. Once again, intent can change. I wouldn't say that China is involved. There's some historical revisionism, but I wouldn't say that China is involved in conquest. I think they are interested in strategic superiority and in strategic subservience on the part of some of their neighbors. I think they are developing a middle kingdom once again. They want China to be the main power in that part of the world. They would prefer that the United States no longer be there, but they understand also the value of having the United States in that part of the world. The United States provides a lot of stability that China has benefited from. China, I think, is also happy to see us strategically distracted in other parts of the world. There's obviously going to be a big debate here in Congress. I hope there will be a big debate, obviously over defense budgets and our ability to make a pivot to the Pacific. I've often been concerned about more, rather than a muscular pivot, than we might end up with a dainty pirouette to the Pacific. And so it's hard to say. I mean, Neil Bohr said, prediction was hard, especially about the future, right? There's also Yogi Berra, who said, the future ain't what it used to be. But I mean, the important thing here is we have to be mindful of Chinese capabilities, the development of them, and then trying to get an understanding of what their strategic interests are. But once again, intents can change rather quickly, and so you have to come up with a national security policy and strategy and structure that is able to deal with any number of challenges in the Pacific. And I think China, the bottom line is China would like to replace the United States as the preeminent power in the Pacific.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Ben?
Pete, you mentioned power projection, and one area that I don't think the recent Commission report touched on as much as last year's report is China's drone program. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, it seems to me that it's fairly advanced at this point, although not on par with ours. Mm-hmm. What's your assessment of the program and where it's headed?
Well, as I mentioned, Commission kind of moves around. We can't cover everything. We have, 8 or so hearings, so we have to kind of choose important issues. And our staff tries to update some of these other issues. But yeah, I mean, the Chinese are tremendous observers of international security issues, including military capabilities. I mean, many people talk about one of the things that really changed Chinese direction in terms of their military capabilities and their desire to put money and manpower into it was Desert Storm. And then later, 1996, the Taiwan crisis and the first election there. Were wake-up calls for them. So, and I remember when my days on the Hill back in the 90s when we were concerned about Chinese looking at our online documents because we were putting everything online, that if you looked at U.S. Army field manuals, this going back many, many years, it's not, maybe not true anymore, it probably is, or equally true, is that most of the hits were coming out of China. They're reading our stuff. But it was open source, it was public. I mean, they were allowed to do that, and that's what led to some of the concerns that came out of the 2000 defense bill. But yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at drones closely in a while, but they're going to come with them. And I mean, for a long time, I've always been a bit of an iconoclast on this, maybe a heretic, but we've talked for so many years about Chinese asymmetric capabilities, but they're building a lot of symmetric capabilities too, like aircraft carriers. I mean, I remember being a staffer on the Hill in the late 1990s, and I were told by people that I still respect that said the Chinese will never have an aircraft carrier. And I would, you know, I saw them buy the Varyag and et cetera, and there was all the rumors about it becoming a casino or a, you know, I mean, there was talk about this sort of thing. And they said, they'll never do it, it's just too hard, they'll never do it. Well, you know where we are today. In fact, I think I was here last year to talk about some China stuff, and I pulled out the China Daily that had the picture of the Liaoning, you know, sorting off for its sea trials. So, you know, they are developing a modern, capable military, and that includes drones. And they are doing whatever they need to do to find the money, find the technology, take it, if necessary, to do this. And I don't doubt that in a number of years the Chinese military will look very similar to the American modern military. Now, what they do with it, that's the big question. And of course, you can ask the question, why do you need a big military? Who threatens you? Well, I think that they understand that that states benefit significantly from their, like people, they feel like that psychologists have told us that people are conscious of their social status. And it often comes down to the fact that they feel they gain more benefits from a higher social status than otherwise. States are the same way, because they are really people. I mean, leaders, they're run by leaders. So whether you buy into that or not, I mean, there is academic work that talks about this. And states feel the same way. The higher they are in the pecking order, the more benefits they receive from their position. And I think China feels the same way. They've had Mao many times, and others have referred to 150 years of Chinese humiliation at the hands of the West, and that goes back to the Opium Wars and the British and the concessions that were made. And of course, this goes from, I think that there's a belief that China's right is to be the Middle Kingdom, at least in that part of the world. But we're seeing them operating, obviously, in some cases on a military basis. They've had a, gosh, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the number of years now, but they've had a flotilla, a task force deployed to the Gulf of Aden for many years now. And there's talk, and we talk about this in the report, the desire to develop military access rights to places in Sri Lanka, which is making the Indians very happy, and Pakistan, which is also with the Indians. So, I mean, I think the Chinese aspire, they don't say it, but I think if you look at their actions, and if you read their words carefully, I think they aspire to having a status atop the international system. And so I think that's a roundabout answer to your drone question, but I think the drones are part of that modern military that will support that, that foreign policy.
So two questions. First, I'm interested in what the disagreements were amongst the commission. You said some things weren't agreed to.
I won't discuss that.
Okay, well, that's.
I mean, I don't recall, frankly.
Okay.
I mean, you know, people you can look at the same sort of issues and come to different conclusions, but I can't. I mean, what I was trying to say is that these are my views. I'm not here to represent the commission. Yeah.
The other part of the question is about kind of looking at first principles when it comes to our conflict with China. I mean, when we became an adversary of China, it was over ideology. You know, they were a revolutionary power, communist. They're no longer communist, and they're, you know, revolutionary only in that, you know, it's the old-fashioned their country over the others around it. Our alliance with countries like Japan is fundamental, but is anybody in the circles that you're traveling in re-examining first principles about where America's national security interest lies in the long term? For example, isn't it possible that China in the long run would be a better ally than Japan? And doesn't it behoove our policymakers to take a real weighing of the relative merits of potential allies in the region and to do what's in our national interest, even though historically we've always been on Japan's side? Is that something that is legitimate, or do we just forfeit all ability to do such a thing because of history?
Well, I think the first thing is I disagree about Chinese and communism. I mean, they're the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, there's no doubt about that. They are. They still are. I mean, there's obviously an interesting sort of divergence from your standard communist ideology with their market-oriented socialism. But no, the government is very much so. It's very much communist government. They expect complete political and social control. And this is and we talk about this in the report, actually. I didn't get into it here, but we talk about domestic stability, the monitoring the internet. My shorthand is that the Chinese government has come up with a social compact with the Chinese people. And this goes back to Deng Xiaoping. He said, it's okay to be rich. And the government has said, and this is why economic development is so critically important to them, they said, we're going to improve your standard of living in exchange for us controlling politics. That's the social compact. So the Chinese government knows that if they're not able to continue to improve the standard of living of the Chinese people, that they've got a problem. This is their view of history. I mean, they've looked very close. They're very astute. My sense is they're very astute students of history. They saw the Soviet Union collapse because the Soviet Union was a military power, but it wasn't an economic power. The Chinese decided it would be better to build that economic base, which would allow you the resources to become a military power. They didn't do it the other way around. So, and even authoritarian governments have to be cognizant and have the pulse on the sense of public opinion. They just, I mean, look at Eastern Europe, at the end of the Cold War. I mean, we see this all the time. Look at Libya. I mean, there's so many things. They have to be cognizant of public opinion. They pay close attention to this. So what they've done is, but they're not going to allow any threats to Chinese government's control of politics in China. China also promised that they would make people proud to be Chinese. Look at the Olympics, other things. They have a lot. They still, I mean, I remember many years ago somebody saying, I mean, imagine trying to run China. 1.3 billion people, and that was many, many years ago. They still have significant challenges: economic degradation, so many things, social issues that they're trying to deal with the Chinese people, trying to do that. But what I think I will answer your question with in a general way, in that there's nothing wrong with assessing the assumptions that you have. I'm not saying there should be any change in our alliance structure, in our concerns about China, but I think we need to decide what our expectations are for our role in that part of the world, and how do we, once we decide that, what I'm basically saying is put together this national security structure based on what we decide we want to achieve. If we want to be the preeminent power, that's going to be different if we're willing to be one of a number large powers in that part of the world. And I think once you decide what you want, then you start to construct your strategy for doing that. And I'd be happy to tell you another time when we have more time about what I think. But I mean, the fact is that I think we need to do that. We're dealing with a dynamic here in China that is significant. There's a dynamic here that we have to be able to decide how we're going to deal with it, because otherwise we won't have any chance of dealing with it. And then you build your national security structure and strategy and capabilities from that. And I think that's okay to, question every angle of. I mean, there's a lot of questions about the pivot. Some people will say, should Taiwan play a larger role in the pivot? So there's a lot of things to be consider out there. I mean, I'm comfortable with our alliance structure, frankly, but there's nothing wrong with reassessing your place in the world, what you want to achieve, and then how you go about doing it.
Did you want to ask a question? Up to the front here.
How do you see the relationship between China and Russia evolving? Obviously some conflict, but also some cooperation.
It was interesting. Anybody who follows Russia issues, I follow at Heritage. I follow just about everything. So I'm spread pretty thin. But I spent a lot of time on Russia this year, not surprisingly. And my background is actually with Russia. If you notice when the Europeans and the Americans, the West, reacted to Crimea, what's going on in eastern Ukraine, Russia is very concerned, obviously. Its major revenue producer is energy. So the Russians were obviously worried about oils and gas sales to Europe and elsewhere. And when it looked like that the West was going to put them under sanctions, make it more difficult to do that, they turned to China and have concluded a number of major energy deals with them. The Chinese are looking for energy diversification. They want pipelines. They're always worried about the Malacca dilemma, that the U.S. Navy would close the Straits of Malacca and they wouldn't be able to have any access to energy. Of course, the Chinese, I think, have also thought that we can do that to other people that may get a lot of energy that comes up through the Malacca Strait. South Korea is also heavily dependent upon energy imports. Not to say that we could talk more about Korea and China another time, South Korea and China. But I think that, that there's a lot of history between China and Russia. There's friction, there's tensions, there's concerns about another rising power. China, the Soviet Union stretches, excuse me, old habits die hard. Russia stretches from Europe to Asia. Vladivostok actually in Russian means power of the East. Had the largest navy during the Cold War, had the largest Soviet navy during the Cold War. I mean, they exert a lot of power in that part of the world. So I think, there are concerns and there's also opportunities. This has been an interesting relationship people have been watching for many years. But even when they had probably the greatest opportunity to be partners during the Cold War, it was still a difficult relationship. So I expect that Putin looks to the East and to the West in his foreign policy and looks for opportunities that will support Russian national interests. I think the Chinese are happy to take Russian energy, Russian military capabilities. It fell off for a while. The Russians found the Chinese copying their flanker fighters, and they stopped co-producing them there, and now they're back. So, a friend in need is a friend indeed, right? So we'll have to see with that relationship. It certainly bears watching, and obviously two powerful countries that the United States needs to be looking at carefully.
Any more questions for Peter? Well, then let's thank him very much. Oh, did I miss?
Did you have a question?
Oh, go ahead, Fred, please.
Real quick question. I don't know if you did anything on the Chinese nuclear arsenal. Are they trying to improve or make more weapons? Maybe this didn't come up.
Yeah, no, we want one of the things we did is we didn't do a hearing on that this year. We've looked at Chinese strategic issues, but we're obviously very very concerned about it, very interested in it, and wondering where we are in terms of has the Chinese nuclear doctrine changed? Has it moved away from minimum deterrence? What sort of arsenal size do they have? We know it's certainly being modernized. While there's concerns about our own arsenal, and the modernization of that. That's been an issue. Much less, and even so in terms of the INF treaty with Russia today, I mean, it's obviously another issue for the United States to be thinking about. But yeah, I mean, we're obviously very concerned about it, especially the increasing survivability, mobility, and lethality of the Chinese second artillery, whether it's Chinese can range, outside of ICBMs, they can range all of the major bases in the Pacific now with ballistic missiles. And many of those ballistic missiles are obviously nuclear capable. So.
All right, is there anyone else? All right, then let's join me, please, in saying thank you to Peter.
Thank you.
Superb presentation.